Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. So today is Self-Improvement Friday. Take it away, John.
Thank you. Thank you. So today we are talking about the importance of turning around habits and what I would say the importance of what we would call non-negotiables. And we are using the movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper to explore this point sequentially. It's important to realize that you have not, if you haven't seen the movie, it's totally fine. We're going to explore the summarization of the movie, and then we're going to get into the relevant points, mainly the implication of bad habits and turning away from boundaries. And then finally, what we can all practically extract from this, how we can apply these principles from this movie and this discussion today to our lives. So with that said, I will dive into the summarization of the movie. And if you haven't seen it, again, totally fine. It's about the main character, again, Bradley Cooper. His name is Eddie Mora in the movie. And it starts out kind of as I would say, a biography of his life. We're following him around as a central character of the plot. And he self-proclaims himself as a writer. And we know through a little bit of investigation, he hasn't written one word in his entire career. So his book is failing. He's just mumbling along to people. He's kind of stringing them along. Oh yeah, I'll put in 100 pages to my publisher by Friday. I'll do this. He tells his friends he's a writer. He tells his girlfriend he's a writer. He tells everybody all these like vague and bleak promises, but he never fulfills them. So his life is just spent in like despondency. He's very hopeless. He just sits around watching TV all day. Obviously, the old cliche, just eating pizza, just lounging around on the couch, behind on his bills, all this. And then I would say the important catalyst in the story is it cuts to a scene of his girlfriend handing him the keys back. So I guess that's like to symbolize their final breaking off of the relationship. Like we're no longer seeing each other. This is it. And then she says, I was your girlfriend. So that's kind of the official cutoff right there. And it's important to realize, I think that relationship for the main character was, I would call, a non-negotiable for him to lose, meaning that it was a boundary. So this would be considered somewhat of his rock bottom. And I think this is encapsulated in the line in the movie where when she says, I was your girlfriend, he says, and I quote, that word doesn't even begin to describe what you are to me. Not what you were, but what you are, like currently are to me. And he says, paramour and inamorata. Those are the words he uses to describe his relationship with this other person. So obviously he's infatuated with her, and I think this would be a catalyst moment in his life. Now, subsequent events, obviously they get a little bit more, I want to say like, not irrelevant, but they kind of do explore off on a tangent insofar as the movie's concerned with this particular topic today. But I could say it's relevant to fill in the plot after. He ends up meeting a extended family member, and he provides him with like a significantly cognitively enhancing nootropic drug that enhances his cognitive capacity and tendency and ability. And he essentially kind of turns his life around, and then he just begins to make a lot of money, becomes successful, writes his book, ends up going through a bunch of trials and tribulations and climbing his way up his hierarchy of success. And of course, it ends with the I guess reconciliation with his girlfriend in the end. So it's a happy ending, I would say. So without all of those supplementary details, because like I said, I understand the plot falls apart when we're beside what we're talking about with habits, but I want to focus on the first quarter or the first third of the movie, where I would look at the importance of this turning around point of having bad habits, of realizing that we are drifting downhill, of realizing that we are doing something or we're on a trajectory that is not desirable. If we extrapolate, if we look into the future, we say this is not going to end well for me, or we know we are just mindlessly drifting along as the days and months and weeks accumulate and just pass us by without any conscious recognition of doing so. We can transition now into the second phase of this discussion, which would be the implication. I would say this is the importance of changing habits and establishing boundaries for ourselves. So as I already established, for Eddie in the movie, his boundary, his rock bottom, his what I would say non-negotiable of a bad habit, of a threshold, would be losing his girlfriend. He was okay with living in squalor and filth. He was okay with being behind on his bills. He was okay with his landlord yelling at him because he was behind on rent. He was okay with eating takeout all the time. He was okay with that. That was all acceptable for him. But the losing of that relationship was not. The cessation of that was a non-negotiable boundary that he refused to accept. So I think that was the low point, which he bounced off, and then he kind of alter the transition or trajectory of his life from that period moving forward. And we know simply that if we do not have, I think, in my opinion, if we don't set up these boundaries, these non-negotiables, it's very easy to mindlessly just drift in one direction. We know an object in motion, of course, tends to what? Stay in motion, just as an object at rest tends to stay at rest. We are creatures of habit. We are creatures of autopilot. And there's we're going to get into a book a little bit later by Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. He actually recently did a TED Talk, or I recently watched a TED Talk rather, about how much of our decisions are habitual and complete autopilot. He says about 40 to, I think it was like 45 or 50% of our behavior is completely, you could say, mindless. It's like the same activity, like the brainwaves, as if we were sleeping. So that's pretty alarming if you look at like your daily life and how much of our decisions are not even made, I would say, consciously. They're made because we did the same thing yesterday, or because they are expedient, or that because they are comfortable. So if we don't establish these boundaries, if we don't say, okay, this is the direction that I want my life to go in, and conversely, a polarization exercise, this is not the direction I want my life to go on. So you set those two ideals, you can say. You set a positive extrapolation into the future and a negative one, and then you can correct course along the way. And I think it's commonly talked about how important it is to set goals and set ideals, set wishes and hopes and dreams and all these things, and having the vision boards and all these things people talk about. But what's not as much talked about is the negative application of that. It's saying, okay, where do I not want to go? Like if I'm drifting downhill, or if I continue my behavior, if I continue my neglect, if I continue being unsupported person in a relationship, or if I continue to neglect my responsibilities at work, if I continue to just not educate myself on my industry or my product or my service, or if I don't continually get better, I'm going to be drifting downhill, because as we know, nothing stays the same. The only law in the universe, the only constant is change. So with every decision, with every day, with every act, we are either progressing, getting better, or we are regressing, we are getting worse. Now, these are very, you can say inconsequential or very extremely meticulous details, but nonetheless, all of our decisions adhere to this law, you can say quantifiably. So I think it's important that we could, or we should rather, articulate these boundaries to us in our own lives, to ourselves in our own lives. And looping back around to something I established earlier, about Charles Duhigg. He wrote the book, The Power of Habit. And what he establishes in that book, the thing that stuck with me, I read this book years ago, so I'm not going to be able to really summarize it, but a particular diagram really, really stuck with me. And he did a bunch of studies on rats, and he did a bunch of quantified studies in humans as well to really fortify this point. And what it was is, you can't necessarily, I would say, dispense a habit. You can't jettison or throw away or get rid of a habit. You can only replace a habit. That was very interesting to me. So what he postulates is, you have a cue. Okay, so you have a cue, you have an action, and you have a reward. So that cue can be something social. It can be something in your physical environment. It can be positive or negative. It could be neutral, right? You have a cue, and it's going to inspire some sort of behavior. And obviously, it's weaker as the habit is newly forming. And once the habit is already established, it's autopilot, and that cue becomes stronger and stronger, and you don't have to consciously think about what you want to do. And then you get the reward, whether it's a quick release of dopamine, whether it's serotonin, whether it's emotional validation, right? All the context and nuances apply for all of these habits. But that is the main structure and function of our habits. There's a cue, there's a routine, and there's a reward. And the only effective and not honestly the only, but the major long-term and effective way to change a habit is to change that routine. So you'll still have a cue, right? You'll still have this unconscious cue. It could be something negative. Maybe okay, so practical example, maybe somebody is getting anxious, they get stressed. That could be a cue, right? They're getting overwhelmed at work. There's a bunch of stuff, they're behind on their things, and that can be a cue for them to de-stress somehow. And through time, through repetition, they've learned, they've conditioned themselves to associate that cue with the action of, let's say, going outside and smoking a cigarette, for example. That can calm their nerves. It gets that stress away for a second, and the reward, okay, maybe they have that dopamine. They get to clear the mind for a little bit. And then that is only fortified with continual repetition of that habit. Now, it can be just as effective to change the action. So change the once you still have the same cue, you change the routine. This can be, practically speaking, maybe, I don't know, deep breaths, or maybe exercise, or maybe just, it could be something different than smoking a cigarette, right? A positive application of that. And you might still get the same reward. Or you can physically reward yourself with some pleasure or some, avoidance from pain in the future with your deliberate conscious effort. So you're still getting that loop. You still have the cue, the routine, and the reward, but you're just a little bit more conscious of it. And there's a secondary book that I want to recommend too, if people are interested in this topic, called Atomic Habits by James Clear. And what he recommends is that when we have these cues, right, when we have these unconscious routines, we should consciously string as much positive habits together as we possibly can. So a practical example, I think it's very, very important for all of us to have either a morning or a nightly routine, or both, because all of the noise throughout the day is very unpredictable. There's a lot of variables in terms of human emotion and human nature and other people and other responsibilities that are outside of yourself throughout your workday or your family life or your kids or your spouse or partner, whatever. All of those things are very unplanned. But you have at least, assuming 10, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, even if you're to wake up a little bit earlier, you can design that first hour of your day to really set yourself up for success, or have a nightcap and kind of reflect on your day and design your day moving forward. But back to the point, James Clear has a book called Atomic Habits. And what he recommends, and I think it's very, very effective, is to cue all of your routines together. So for example, let's say you wake up and you want to start the habit of running when you wake up, or going to the gym or something. So a cue can be something as practical or simple as putting your running shoes right next to your bed. So right when you stand up out of bed, it's the first thing you see. So that's your cue right there. Or hanging your workout shirt on your bedroom door handle. So you have to consciously interact with that item before you unconsciously go about your morning routine, right? So that can be a cue. And then when you get home, maybe you go on your run, you get home, and then you can, right when you get in, you go to your kitchen, and on the counter is maybe you prepared your breakfast from the night prior. So there's your cue to eat your healthy breakfast. And then you have your work stuff for the day. And then you plan forward whatever habits do you want to implement in your life. You can implement all of these cues and kind of enmesh them together to create the successive routine of a positive routine, not just one habit. And I think that's very effective. And a practical way, so I think this would be moving into the application trinity of this part of the discussion. A practical way to kind of bring all of this home is something that I've used for years is tracking. So what I do is, I think it's very important to realize how much of our behavior is unconscious, is how much of our behavior is on autopilot, how much of our behavior is a compensatory act to a random cue we have in our environment. So what we can do is bring more awareness to this by, well, how I do this is tracking on a physical journal or physical piece of paper. I write down what I do when I wake up, what I have to eat, my goals for the day, my to-do list. I check off my to-do list. I reflect in the day. So I do adhere to this strict morning and nightly routine. So that no matter what happens today, no matter how chaotic, how unplanned it was, how many obstacles or people I came across in that day, I still have those two, the beginning and the end of the day to kind of set more order into my life, you could say. And when you write things down, it makes it very, very practical. It makes it very real. So a simple example is, nobody, quote unquote, knows if you, I don't know, ate junk food today, or didn't hit the gym today, or didn't complete your routines, or didn't complete the tasks that you had to do at work today. Nobody, quote unquote, knows. I mean, your conscience does, because you might get guilty, 5-10 years in the future, or you might beat yourself up because of it. Or simply speaking, the law of cause and effect might, return to you unfavorable circumstances in the future because of your neglect in the present. So when you start tracking things, when you start writing things down, I heard a phrase about journaling. When you write things down, you look at your own thoughts staring back at you. It's a very powerful statement. You see your own thoughts staring back at you. So it kind of pulls you out of the moment. It pulls you out of this, you can say monkey-brained routine, and it crystallizes your thoughts. It crystallizes your beliefs. It crystallizes your habits. And you look at exactly what you're doing in the present moment and in the present day. So I've used tracking. It's been extremely powerful for me for formulating new habits, and also polarizing unfortunate or destructive habits that I've unfortunately accepted in the past. So one way is tracking. The second way is a change of environment. Now, if anybody actually watched the movie Limitless, I found it very, very interesting that the first thing he did when he consumed this, this exogenous drug that increases cognitive capacity, The first thing he did, he went back to his apartment and he said, I can't operate in this filth. Okay, I need to clean everything. And there was like this little montage of like 10 clones of him just cleaning everything in the apartment. So it's like it's an optimum workspace. It's very conducive to him having different cues in his environment. And I think our environment provides us with these cues that reinforces these habits. So if we have a unsupportive environment, this can be a physical environment, it could be a messy desk, it could be garbage all over the place, it could be a social environment, it could be people that reinforce poor habits, right? If we are planted in this bad environment, all of our conscious efforts to change our habits, you can say, would be fruitless. I heard a quote that said, if a flower is failing to bloom, you do not condemn the flower, you ensure it is in the proper soil for it to bloom, right? So that's a practical metaphor and analogy we can use to our everyday life. If we are behind in some circumstance, if we are behind in some area of our life, we should look at our environment. We shouldn't condemn ourselves, because obviously we have the capacity, we have the faculties to do better. But if we're not doing better, it's very likely because of our environmental stimuli and input. So practically speaking, what we can do is, I've done this myself. You can organize certain corners of your room to be associated with certain mental states. And psychology has done a lot of research on this in particular. And if you don't have, as much room in your apartment or your loft or something like that, I've done this as well with particular maybe coffee shops or cafes. You can go and maybe you say, okay, I'm only going to work on my emails at this particular coffee shop, or I'm only going to check social media on my phone when I'm on my couch in my living room or something like that. And this way, you're not going to have this enmeshed mess of like a bunch of random cues for random rewards, random hits of dopamine, and you're not going to be misguided in your daily life. You're not going to be pulled astray by all of these external influences that are demanding of your attention. I think it's especially more relevant today than ever. So the first application, we have awareness, which would be, I would say, tracking. The second is, I would say, changing our environment. This could be a physical change of environment. It could be designing your routine in I don't know, if you randomly go out and get a hotel or get an Airbnb and you wake up and you say, okay, what does my ideal day look like? You don't have your old cues as you would in your bedroom, right? You don't have your old cues. You don't have all that environment. If you're in a new environment, it's going to bring your conscious faculties up to the forefront so you can design your own routine. I've actually done this to change some of my parts of my routine in my own life as well. So the first is tracking, like I said, the second is environment. And the third way I would say is to ensure that we realize how detrimental our habits could be. So if you have a sneaking suspicion that you are engaged in a bad habit, I think one practical exercise we can do to illuminate the efficiency or destructive power of this habit is to extrapolate. So ask yourself a simple question. This is a question I actually ask myself every single day on my daily journal sheet. I ask myself, what is the compounded result of this day? So that means if I repeated this day over and over and over for 100 days, if I was somehow locked into like this infinite loop of this one day, what does my life look like? Or what does the world look like? If everybody lived the day that I lived, what does the world look like? Or more importantly, on a personal level, like I said, what does my life look like? Am I a healthy, strong, competent, proud, sociable, outgoing, enthusiastic, lovely person? Or is this going to breed resentment and envy and malice and resentment, right? So that's an important question to ask ourselves. And you don't have to do it with the entire day. You can do it with one simple habit. You can ask yourself after a habit, after you engage in a routine, right? It might be short-term or long-term. You can ask yourself, how do I feel after I complete this habit? Okay, how do I feel? Short-term, you might get a hit of dopamine, like a habit. Maybe you get an urge to check social media. Next thing you know, you're getting inundated with information for an hour about all people's negative opinions and gossip and drama and all this. And you feel I don't know about you, but I know I feel very disempowered when I consume all that information. So I bring more awareness to my, I guess, emotional reaction to particular habits or particular actions, and then I can reinforce those or jettison them if I want. And people tend to respond to emotion or logic arguments differently. So to be sure that a habit is detrimental or not, I think it's effective to approach it from both angles. So first would be, you could say emotional. So this would be pertaining to your values. So ask yourself, if I do this habit 100 days in a row, how does this affect my, and then fill in the blank with your important areas of your life. You can say career, you can say work, you can say your relationship with your children, you can say relationship with yourself, whatever it happens to be, whatever your particular values are. How does this action, how does this habit affect these values to you, right? What result does it bring in those areas of your life? And write it down on paper. So that would be an emotional argument against a bad habit. A logical argument against a bad habit can be realms that are a little bit more quantifiable, right? So maybe something like career or income level, or, you know what I mean? Like weight or health or something like this, like biometrics. You can quantify them. You can write them down in numbers. How does this habit of, smoking cigarettes affect, you can say my blood pressure even, or something like this, or cholesterol? Like, you can get numbers on those. You can extrapolate into the future. So that's a logical, that's a little bit mixed into both logical and emotional, of course, because the health detriments would, of course, affect those other values of your life as well: social life, family life, etc., career. So those are like the three, I would say, main ways that I would use to transition our way out of bad habits. So to quickly recapitulate everything, first, I would say tracking. So realizing what we are doing in the moment, stop living on autopilot, start writing things down, start bringing more conscious awareness to your decisions, whether this is a mobile app, whether it's a physical journal, whether it's a food journal, whether it's making a grocery list, whatever happens to be, writing things down. It's going to put more awareness into your daily actions and habits. Second is a change of your environment. This could be something as simple as going to a different supermarket, so you're not habitually going in the same aisles and getting the same junk food. It could be waking up in a different place to design your morning routine more consciously and more deliberately. It could be assigning certain areas of your house or your office or cafes and coffee shops around you to associate with a particular psychological state. And the final point is to ensure that we recognize how detrimental our habits are by making a clear-cut logical and clear-cut emotional case for why these are disempowering and why they are not serving us. So I'm going to pass it to Shrikant to moderate Q&A.
Wonderful, folks. So it's time for Q&A. As usual, we got 4 rules. Number 1, type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. All right, so it's going to be Michael followed by Alex next. Michael, go ahead.
Hey, John, thanks for that summary there. Really appreciate that. Question for you: of the cues that you've implemented in your life, which one of those cues was hardest to follow? And then what habits were you trying to change or create from that cue?
Very good question. So I'm not going to, I wouldn't think I'm 100% over it, but I'm trying to significantly limit my time on social media, for example. So I have a cue, whether it's in the morning or whether it's in the evening, to unconsciously check my phone out of habit. Like when I wake up, I say, okay, what's going on in the world? But the problem with that is I'm inundated with all other opinions before I even check in with myself. I'm checking in with other people and what other people are doing before I'm even checking in on my own life and how I feel in the moment and what I should do moving forward. So that's been a very, I would say, detrimental cue. And how I've been trying to mitigate that and circumvent it is because I still use my phone for an alarm, of course. So what I'll do is I'll have a long charger and I'll put it across the room. And that way, when I wake up, I hear the alarm. So it's kind of beneficial in 2 ways. One, I'm forced to literally stand up out of my bed. I can't hit snooze because my alarm is blaring at me from across the room. And 2, once I'm standing, I'm more apt to like have these other cues. Like, okay, my laptop's up. I'm going to type. One of my first routines in the morning is type for a half a page everything I'm grateful for. So that's one of my cues. I have my laptop out on my desk it's already flipped open and everything. So I go hit cancel on my alarm, and then I go right to my laptop. And if it's not over there, I notice I'll have that cue and that routine of like checking social media, checking my notifications, checking my messages, and that's very detrimental for me. So that's something I've been trying to implement a lot.
Excellent. Next up is Alex followed by Aaron. Alex, go ahead.
I guess my question is, what is the importance of a habit tracker to changing habits?
Okay, so I think this is very idiosyncratic. It's very temperamental in terms of like some people respond better to numbers. Some people respond better to accumulating data. In particular, me, why I have things like my daily sheet and my trackers and all these things. I just love looking at a quantified increase in my life. So I don't like value judgments of like, I feel healthier. Personally, for me, I'm very, I don't know, numerically or mathematically oriented. If I can measure and say, oh, I am, 8% stronger in the gym than I was last month, or I weigh X amount of pounds more, or you know what I mean, or less, whatever my goal happened to be. So when you have a habit tracker, I mean, this would somewhat be a habit tracker, but I know people have apps and all these things like this. It brings more awareness to the daily activities. And then it's also going to be a positive feedback loop, because you're not going to want to break that streak, you could say, because it's going to increase a dopamine when you have like, okay, I'm on this path, I'm on this current trajectory, and I'm going to extrapolate. It helps you realize I would say destination. It's easier to extrapolate when you have more data, right? So if you had a little bit of data, you have to do a lot of guessing where you're going to end up. The more data you have, I think it's easier to correctly extrapolate and estimate the future.
Next up is Aaron, Joe, and Julie. Aaron, go ahead.
Great film, really good choice. I watched this film not too long ago. Just want to add a few extra things that he does to kind of improve his life. He becomes really perceptive and aware of his environment. I think there's a scene in the film where he bumps into his landlord and he notices some obscure law book, and then he like makes a comment about it, and then he gets off not having to pay a month's worth of rent. And I think this is like indicative of like people who are trying to become a lot smarter, that they can become a lot more curious about other people and a lot more aware of their surroundings, and start using those surroundings to their advantage. Even when he's dealing with the Robert De Niro figure, he's always thinking in his head, what does this Robert De Niro guy want? How can I provide Robert De Niro with what he needs? And he's constantly aware of that. So I think in addition to doing the push-ups and cleaning his apartment and all that other stuff, I think just being very curious and really aware of your surroundings also leads to more beneficial outcomes.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite movies, honestly. But there's an important part in that scene you actually brought up with that when he's talking about the law book that he saw in college. It's not that like that information wasn't there. It's just it wasn't accessible to him, which is like the whole subconscious mind argument, right? Everything you see, all the sense impressions are recorded until they need to be accessed, you could say. Same thing with like physiologically speaking with like adrenaline, right? You have this capacity to do something until you need it, and then you're going to exhibit superhuman strength, so to speak. It's not that these cues or these things weren't available in his environment. He just wasn't on the right frequency to be able to recognize them. He wasn't on the frequency to recognize these opportunities because he was so stuck in his environment with all of these cues, like, oh, watch TV, eat pizza, order takeout, just like whatever he was doing, throwing his basketball around his room, all of these cues that he had. And like I said, the first thing he did is just dispense with all of that. So I thought that was very, very telling of like the importance of our environment.
Thanks. Next up is Joe, followed by Julie. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, John. Great presentation. Actually, you froze in the middle for me, so I just have a really quick question you may have already covered, so forgive me if I'm asking this and you already covered it. Is that, do you have a framework for basically selecting what a non-negotiable is, and do you have an example of a non-negotiable?
Very, very good question. So I think our values would change. They would be very dynamic. So personally, I have an exercise that I do every single New Year's. And it's what I was talking about in the beginning of the presentation. I set a positive ideal of myself. So I ask myself, what do I want to be in my career, in my health, in my social life, romantic life, everything. I try as best I can to get as articulate and defined and meticulous with details as possible, down to specific numbers. So that's my positive ideal, you could say. And then also every year I ask, okay, what does my life look like if I don't hit those things? And I ask myself, I kind of make a more emotional case in this because it's hard for me to quantify, of course. But I say, how unsatisfied would I be if I didn't hit this? And then from there, I can say, okay, my non-negotiables are essentially like, I always want to be progressing my former self, right? So it's like my non-negotiable would be something to, I don't know, regress past at a level I once was. And I mean like on a larger scale. I don't mean like daily little ebb and flows, because obviously success, growth, anything isn't linear. Of course, it's like exponential. You have a bunch of ups and downs until you zoom out and then you see like, okay, I'm on the right trajectory. So like little things day in and day out. Yes, you could say I'm down. But in terms of like, I use a 1 year increment. So that's what I use. And it tends to work. I always want to be like more than what I was at the summation of the following year. So you can say a non-negotiable would be like 12 months ago, that summary, right? Like exactly where I was, that's my non-negotiable. If I pass that, like that's chaos. I haven't yet, so we're good so far.
Next up is Julie, followed by Wesley. Julie, go ahead.
Hi. Is it true that after doing this 27 times, the new routine could be your new default? And if that is true, do you lose mindfulness? And then second, what do you find to be the biggest reason people fail at doing this? Thanks.
Thank you. There's been a lot of studies. I've heard a bunch of random numbers. I've heard 27, I've heard 31, I've heard 67, I've heard 30, I've heard, you know what I mean? I've heard 14, even with some people. I don't know that it's necessarily like a quantified thing. I just feel like you can actually, this is actually in Atomic Habits, that book that I brought up. When I first designed my routine, so first of all, backing up, I do see very, very strong validity in doing things doing things repeatedly. I actually consolidated my routine from this book down into, let's say it's 9 actions, okay? These 9 actions, they might take 10, 15, 20 minutes each. But what I wanted to do is prime my brain for all of these cues to line them all up together. So what I did is I did a 1-minute version of each of my habits, and I lined them in together in 9 minutes. Okay. So for example, I wake up, I'll type on my computer everything I'm grateful for 60 seconds. And then my next discipline would be stretching. So I'll stretch for 60 seconds. Okay. My next discipline would be listen to an audiobook. So I'll listen to an audiobook for 60 seconds. And then I would go downstairs and I'd make tea and then get breakfast ready. And then I'd go upstairs and I'd read. So I'd read for 60 seconds. And what I was doing is I was priming my brain to associate all of these cues in line together. So it didn't necessarily take me 27 days. It took me 27 repetitions of this particular cycle. You can do that in one day, even if you had enough patience, of course. So I don't know that it's necessarily days. I think it's more so like the neurons just linking together all of these cues. And I wouldn't say it's eradicating mindfulness out of that. If anything, it's being more mindful because you are designing that routine by your own volition. You're designing it on your own accord because it's getting you closer to your ideal. So I would say that's actually more mindful than just living passively or living by proximity and just doing whatever we felt like doing emotionally for that particular day. And your final question, why do we fail to do this? That's actually a question I'm going to save for the breakout group because that's something we're going to discuss in a few minutes.
Next up is Wesley. He asks, if limitless in head means intellectual prowess, what does limitless in heart mean?
Limitless in heart. I would say not, this is an extrapolation, this is obviously an estimate. I would say not getting emotionally defensive on other people when they're trying to do things for you, even if you don't agree with the premise. I would say treating, I mean, this is obviously cliche, but treating others as yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean the golden rule of like, okay, you want everything nice for people. You want everything. You want everybody to grow. You want everybody to experience hardship. You would want everybody to be supplied and equipped with the strength to experience all of their hardships to overcome. I think you wouldn't be defensive on people. I think you wouldn't lash out. I think your ego would be very in check if you were limitless in heart, so to speak. I think there wouldn't be any perception of a duality between me and you. I think it would be one and the same. I think you'd be very connected to source. I think you would, I think you'd be very attuned to extrapolating your decisions and how they affect other people versus what you get from your decisions. That's kind of how a lot of us operate from our ego. It's like, I'm doing this decision because I want a reward. I think it would have a bigger scale impact of your daily decisions and your actions. And I think it would be you would look at your life as a universal, I guess, maxim or like principle, as Kant would say, and asking yourself, if everybody were to live my life, what does the world look like? It's a very interesting intellectual exercise to ask yourself that if you are kind of engaging in a moral and ethical stance on your life. So those are some attributes I think you would have with a limitless heart.
Excellent. Next up is Jonathan. Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Shrikant. Hey, John, I enjoyed the speech again today. I was thinking about something that you touched on recently, which is when you have a habit, being able to imagine or project out what the consequences of practicing that habit regularly will actually be. And you gave one way to do that, which I think is really good. And I haven't done that myself, which is try and project out if you kept doing this every day, if for 100 days or whatever it is, who would you be? Are there any other tools or approaches that you found helpful to projecting out a habit so it has the same intensity as like this big truck coming towards you about to hit you, as opposed to this kind of abstract I will be, because you don't know what person you'll actually become. It still doesn't have that intensity of like it's going to hit you in the face if you do this.
Mm-hmm. Very good question. I mean, a lot of it kind of is subject to kind of remain in the conceptual realm. But one example can be what I was answering to the first question would be, which is like maybe like tripling down on that habit. So it's like maybe one of your habits, it's like, I don't know, exercise or reading or something like vaguely beneficial. Maybe just like implementing it so you can see a profound, like quantifiable increase within like a very short period of time, maybe like a week or something. So you go all out on exercise, or you go all out on reading, and you like implement it to a very significant portion of your free time in your day. And then you say, okay, is this worth investing all of that time into, or am I hitting a wall of like diminishing returns, or am I plateauing, or like where's this little sweet spot that I should be with this particular habit? Or is it just exponentially fulfilling in a positive cycle? Like the more I put in, the more I get out. Then I should just triple down on that. So I think that's one way of like I said, when I first designed my routine, I did like a little 9-minute section, like a microcosm of it. And I consolidated everything to 60 seconds. And I kept repeating that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to get all these cues together. So like, I would say a version of that for one particular habit, maybe do it multiple times in a day instead of just like once in the morning or once in the evening. But other than that, I think, like I said, unfortunately, it has to kind of remain conceptual until we make conceptual thoughts real through our actions, of course. And sometimes, unfortunately, we do have to be sometimes patient with things and kind of realize feedback. But that's the other thing. Some people can be in a routine of implementing their habit, implementing these actions into the world. But if they're not capturing the results on paper, I think that can be very, it can be very disempowering, because you might not know if it's objectively constructive or deconstructive, or if it's just like if passively feels good, but it's not actually giving you a net return. It's not necessarily a good investment of your time.
Excellent. So what other questions do you have for the breakout rooms?
Okay, for the breakout groups. So we have 3 main questions. The first is, why is it so difficult for some of us to draw boundaries and say no, whether that's to other people, whether that's to ourselves, kind of in particular, like setting up these non-negotiables, setting up these boundaries. Why is that hard for some people? The second question is, what can be some consequences of losing our non-negotiables? So let's say, like going back to the film, Eddie Mora, he said, I'm not going to lose my girlfriend. I'm not doing that. That's my last straw. What if he just accepted that? Like, what would the movie turn out to be if he did that? Third question is kind of pertaining to the question we were asked earlier. Why do we continue bad habits, even if we intellectually know they are unhealthy or destructive? Why do we continue to do them?
Okay. Can you again summarize them very quickly, the 3,
Yes.
so that they have it?
Why is it hard for us to say no?
Okay.
What are the consequences of losing non-negotiables? The third is, why do we continue to engage in bad habits?
Excellent. Welcome back, folks. All right, so it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can talk about your takeaways and put your questions on the table. So I'm going to call on people in the order in which I see them, and then we'll go from there. If you want to skip, you can go ahead and type skip. All right. Let me see. So it's going to be Mark, Deborah with a H, and Aaron next. Mark, go ahead.
Oh, wow. I didn't even have time to write my thoughts out. I guess my question would be, the approach that seems to be being suggested is a highly structured approach. And obviously people are different about how much structure they can absorb in their lives. But also, like, my real question is, how does one deal with the fact that you can have a plan, you can have a structure, but real life will always interfere with that? You might be able to control the first hour of your day, but as soon as you go to your job, your boss, your customers, your users, or just your personal relationships, they all want some of your time and energy. So how do you balance structure versus a lack of structure?
Excellent. Excellent. So John, you're also keeping track of all the questions, right? And then we'll go ahead and conglomerate all of them and go from there. Next up is Deborah, Aaron, and Alex. Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, so Aaron is in my group, so we might have something similar, but I would say my thought is maybe a non-negotiable should be your own self-respect, because we were talking about the fact that why would you chase someone who dumped you in the case of the movie? And so I guess I would ask, do you outgrow people if you maybe like learn your own value? And then in that case, how important is the connection versus like, I don't know, personal fulfillment or even status?
Okay. Thank you, Deborah. Next up is Aaron, Alex, and Jonathan. Aaron?
Yeah, I was in the same room as Deborah, and we also focused a lot on the third question that John posed. And I think it goes down this idea of like why people don't break bad habits. And I kind of went back to what, Viktor Frankl said about having ultimate meaning. And I think a lot of people make resolutions of like, yeah, man, I want to get in shape. It's New Year's. Yeah, man, I want to do this. And they just make all of these like wonderful goals for themselves. But if they don't have like an overarching mission or purpose or meaning for doing those things, it tends to just like crumble. And when something cool or fun comes along, they tend to abandon that really hard thing that they should be working on. But if you have like an ultimate purpose of like, yes, I want to do this so that at the end of the day, I can achieve that. Well, now that kind of just breaks the bad habit for you. So a lot of people directly attack the bad habit and say, I want to break this bad habit. But I think the best way to break a bad habit is to supplement it with some good habits and purpose, So I think it's kind of like a reverse way of doing it.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Next up is Alex, Jonathan, and Joe. Alex?
Skip.
Okay. Next up is Jonathan, Joe, and Stefan. Jonathan.
Shrikant, who's the question to? Is this to John or is this a general group question?
It's a general question. General question you would like to put on the table.
Okay. So the general question would be, how do we concretize the consequences or impact of certain habits or actions we take and project them out into the future?
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Joe, Stefan, and let me see who is there. Gene. Joe, go ahead.
Well, the first part is it's very much along the same lines that Mark had brought up, and it kind of leads into the second question of when to say no. Like in the course of our days, I'm not a parent, but I do know, if you're taking care of someone that is ill, then that your day has a lot of variation in it. So, when do you say no? And then when do you say no, even in the course of the day at work? If somebody comes to you with a problem, what's the decision framework that may break that habit, that, when to break away from that habit, when not to? So it's never been very clear to me, especially if somebody's in a situation of need. The answer to the third question that was interesting as well in our takeaways was the idea of why we may engage in a bad habit is that we may be incrementally breaking a bad habit. So therefore, if you're just not going to go full board into something and say it's all or nothing tomorrow, and that will lead you'll still be breaking the habit per se. You'll still be engaging in the bad habit, but it'll be incremental progress that you're making towards a goal. So that would be a situation where but when to how to measure you're making that incremental progress is critical, as John had talked about with the idea of tracking. So those are the two major takeaways that I have.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Next up is Jean, David Roller, and Christy. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, our group talk about why we have hard time to say no to people. Actually, personally, I don't feel that hard to say no. I think part of the reason we at a certain age we all learn how to not be affected by other people's opinion. Like I was learned to do it when I was middle school. Maybe I overcompensate. Sometimes I easily go to the other extreme. I think that's my question. Sometimes you go from one extreme to the other. I realized, sometimes I didn't notice that maybe hurting other people by not noticing it, by not pay too much attention. So I think the danger sometimes is like you go to the other extreme, because Jordan Peterson mentioned the reason we care about the other people's opinion is for our own benefit. We are living in this tribe culture because we rely on other people to take care of us in kind of danger or whatever. So the social environment, but because of that, it's become a hinder to our self-expression. So it's kind of balancing between this. So I think either extreme will be bad. We have to find a middle way at some point as they get matured.
Thanks. Okay, before I go on, let me tell you about the things that are coming up. This weekend, we got 4 meetups. I'm going to be talking about man as a designing animal, the concept of design kind of integrating all our faculties. Number 2, that's going to be Saturday at 12:30 Eastern time. Tomorrow, Saturday at 2:30 Eastern time, Jeff will be talking about productive disagreements. How do you disagree with people, and what's the effective way of doing that? He's been running workshops on that for 30 years. So he's going to share various tricks for doing that. On Sunday, my friend Michael will be talking about his philosophical calendar. The theme is going to be about setting things right in the world. At 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, Angela Cotilesa will be back, and she will be talking about the social and emotional components, issues about being a polymath. So that's what is coming up on the weekend. So let's continue with David Roller, Christy, and Julie. David?
So the one question that we had was regarding being able to structure your day, and how can you effectively communicate to others when you're trying to partition out a portion of your day and setting a boundary to not be interrupted without, I guess, having people become offended by it or not looking, having negative reaction because you don't respond to their emails or you don't take their phone calls because you're trying to establish a boundary.
Thanks, David. Next up is Christy, followed by Julie. And then for everybody else, there are lots of skips. So if you want to give your takeaway or put a question, just go ahead and type exclamation mark. Christy, go ahead. Okay, next up is Julie.
I'm sorry, when you get a chance, maybe you could clarify the non-negotiable. I know that with him, the relationship was non-negotiable. Therefore, when it fell apart, he fell apart and he started to create his life. I'm thinking that hit his bottom. So in that sense, I'm thinking non-negotiable is a negative thing, but I can think, anyways, I'm totally confused about the non-negotiable, about the point of that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. All right. So I think we've got quite a few questions on over here. So what do you see as a pattern in them, John?
So I think to I think one main pattern that would be very worthy of exploring is something that I attempted to address earlier, but as this was actually mainly Mark's question, but it kind of encompasses other ones too. I would say, in short, how to impose order in the midst of chaos, you could say, right? So how to impose structure on a very chaotic world, even if that chaotic world's inside of ourselves, right? Our own internal dialogue, our own bad habits, our conscience, all of this internal turmoil, but also external turmoil. How can we deal with structure in the midst of chaos? My answer was like, okay, have your routine in the morning, have your routine in the evening, do what you can in those little periods, measure them. But again, as Mark did say, this is very idiosyncratic. I love data. I'm very structured. I'm very, monotonous. I love doing the same thing over and over, very disciplined. So it might not work for other people. And I totally accept that, totally understand that. So I think we can open that for inquiry.
Okay.
I think that'd be open.
So that's one. I think the non-negotiable idea is a very good idea. I think that there was lots of questions. So let's do these two. How about that?
Yeah,
okay.
That works.
So on the first one, firstly, I want to say something. I mean, I think this is kind of heart of planning, because plans are all, you make plans knowing fully well that they're going to change. So the best example of that we've discussed that in our meetups is the OODA loop. You're kind of orienting yourself in the world and saying, this is what I need to do. But after you orient yourself and take actions, you are actually observing what is going on and you are reorienting yourself. So there is this constant process. And this OODA loop is designed in a military context where the chaos is far more than a normal life. And this works well. But at the same time, you do need that orientation. You need to summarize in your mind, what is your objective and how are you going to get there? If you don't have a clear purpose, you have no clear direction to go in. And even when you start walking along the path of that, you can take a feedback. There are these feedback loops that you use in order to take in new information that is coming in to kind of reorder. So I do think that actually planning allows you to move around in a chaotic world far more effectively than if you did not plan. John, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you in the particular, especially in the particular aspect where you said, if you don't have a clear purpose, you don't have a clear direction. I think the clearer we articulate our end goal, our design, our ideal, our whatever happens to be, the clearer our actions become in both ways, in both the positive and the negative way. So the clearer I articulate my ideal, my goal, the clearer it becomes what I should do and what I should not do, right? So if it's a vague goal, like I want to be healthy, I want to be more intelligent, I want to be a more sociable person, that's vague. It's not going to really help me in the present. If I quantify it, if I put a number on it, if I can measure it, if it's very specific and very emotionally motivating, I know exactly what I should do and shouldn't do. So then I'm going to get closer to that. And then you obviously superimpose that again in the future. But yes, I completely agree with the whole structure and routine thing. Absolutely as well.
Wonderful. So folks, this is the time to give any comments or questions about this issue of how do you handle structure? When in the midst of chaos, how do you keep, how do you handle that? So any questions and comments, you can go ahead and type ! If you'd like to follow up on that. Jean, you're first. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't expect so quick. So I want to give example how to handle this chaos. For example, I try to exercise. Actually, I tried to for a while. So I finally joined 3 exercise group. And one is 7:30 with a landmark group, younger people, 20 something. Then the other group is a yoga group, 8:30. And another group is 9:30 with some mom group. So then my kids have to go to school 4 days a week. I have to send him from 8:30 to 9. So I found I have to do alternate schedule to make it work. So I have to skip yoga for a week when he's in school. Then I have to wake up at 7:30 to join the other exercise. Then the other week, I will do the yoga instead. So I keep doing the 9:30 one in both cases. So anyway, so that's one example. When dealing with my chaotic life, I have to do my work, I have kids, all the other things come together. So that's how I deal with it.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. I think that's a great idea. That's also a very big idea in military science. Like when you're trying to take an objective, you have actually multiple groups, multiple companies trying to do the same thing, because you do not really know which of them is going to face more opposition, which of them is going to be easy. And so you have these three prongs trying to do the same thing. And then whichever one succeeds, you put more behind that. Next up is Joe, Mark, Aaron, and Deborah.
Yeah, actually, I don't have much to add to that because I think that you actually just captured it with the idea of reorientation is really kind of critical. So you even say you have multiple groups that are competing for your time and energy. You really kind of have to figure out just a way to prioritize that. Even if you're just managing a small team, you would have to do the same thing. I guess that where it becomes a little bit more difficult and challenging is, I would say, is that when are you balancing the professional and the personal in that world? Like, and that is a challenge. Sometimes somebody needs somebody, and that individual, even though it's a personal matter, if you were to lose that individual, then you would also pay a price for that. So it's kind of like, how do you balance the personal and the professional? I think is maybe a little bit more of a challenging question, because you can reorient in a professional setting pretty quickly because you know what your goals are, and you just have to pick and go. But that's just I don't know if that really moved anything forward. But.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Mark, Aaron, Deborah, and Michael.
Okay. So yes, thanks, Shrikant, John. I agree with your comments. My approach is to always try and build flexibility into my plans. I guess I should acknowledge that I'm a professional project manager. So I look at terms like contingencies, dependencies, like what do I have control over? What are outside forces that I need to be aware of that can upset my plan, and build in flexibility so that if things don't go according to plan, I can recover from them. But I also just wanted to mention the metaphor of the sailboat sailing towards a direction. Like, you're never in control of the direction of the wind or the strength of the wind, but what you can do is always be aware of the direction you want to move towards your goal. So I always like to try and keep that in mind. And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Next up is Aaron, Deborah, and Michael.
So one thing you can always have control over, even in chaos, is not getting involved in other people's drama. You always have that power to sort of avoid other chaotic cyclones that are heading your way. And I'll give you a really good example of this. If you've ever been in school, one of the most chaotic things that can happen in school is when there's a substitute teacher. Like, the kids just go absolutely nuts and go basically batshit crazy. And when that would happen when I was in school, one of the things I would do, since I had like part-time jobs and things like that, is I would actually just do my homework for other classes when there was a substitute. Like, I would just take out my whatever and start doing my work and being like, great, these monkeys over here are going crazy. Let me go ahead and just do my homework so I don't have to be bothered with that later. And that's like an example of not being involved in other people's drama. Whereas no matter how crazy the people around you are acting, just kind of take care of your own stuff and don't really affiliate with people that are going in a negative cyclone.
Thanks, Aaron. Next up is Deborah.
Okay. So I was thinking about this, and it's weird because I actually feel like I've been more productive in some ways since the pandemic started. And I was one of those people who was like, okay, there's so many people who are putting pressure on themselves to accomplish things, to have concrete goals. And I'm not going to do that. I feel like the world is very chaotic right now. It's already really stressful. So I'm going to focus on things like I enjoy. And I ended up taking a class and like completing that and joining all these meetups and reading books and doing all these things, because I didn't necessarily plan them. But I realized that one of the positive reinforcement aspects of that was that I was doing it with other people. And there was that social aspect. And I guess there's an element of like emotional support there, but it's also kind of like there's just interaction. like I miss that too, just hanging out with people and stuff. So even just having those conversations and having common interests and like something to work toward without putting pressure on myself meant that I was actually doing all these things. So I feel like if you do things with other people and if you feel like, you know, you're actually socializing with people, I feel like that can make a huge difference, and that can make you maybe stick to goals or even just, I guess, accomplish things without realizing you're doing that. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Deborah. I think each of us is different, and the different things work for different people. So next up is Michael, Jonathan, Jairo, and Paul. Michael, go ahead.
The best way to keep order in the midst of chaos is to give yourself space. And the best way to give yourself space is to really start being strict with yourself and identifying the distractions that exist on the path to your objective. So whether that be watching too much TV, checking your social media too much, or even in the car, if you have that extra time, are you just distracting yourself with music? Like, you have to ask yourself, is this thing that I'm engaging in helping me reach my objective? And if the answer is no, that means cut it out, period. Just be really black and white about it.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Next up is Jonathan, Jairo, and Paul.
Thank you. Hey, Mark, this is specifically to you, but also to anyone else. You mentioned you're a project manager, and one thing you do in your work is you do try plan things out, but you build in for unexpected situations coming up, contingencies, that kind of thing. I'd be curious to hear what specifically you do, like in order to map out a certain period and then still allow for flexibility enough to readjust when things come up. Like, are there specific approaches you take, specific tools, ways you think about it, anything like that?
Mark, you can go ahead and respond. Mark, okay. Would you like to respond? Yeah. I don't know why. You're on mute. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I couldn't unmute. Sorry. Well, thank you for the question. That's a huge topic, but like one of the simple things is like if you've got a plan, just like you're trying to build a bridge, you need concrete, you need steel girders, and you've got a day when they need to be delivered. Well, what happens if they don't show up on time? So you don't order them to show up the day you need them. You order them a week to show up a week ahead. So that's the thing. That's a very simple example of date contingency. But in terms of the personal life, you could say, okay, I have a plan to always go to the gym for this class from 6 till 7. Well, what happens if you've got a business call and you can't make it? Your backup plan would be, oh, well, there's another class that maybe is not good, but it's at 9 o'clock. So that's my contingency backup. I can go, there's an alternate class I can go to, so I can still live up to my original plan of work, of having exercise for 45 minutes. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Mark. Let's go ahead. I don't want to do too much back and forth. I just wanted to quick, give opportunity for you to answer. Next up is going to be Jairo, followed by Paul and Stefan. Jairo, go ahead.
So the first question gave me the idea of why not apply it to oneself? Like, why is it hard for me to say no to not do this or that that could affect my non-negotiable or my goals?
Okay.
Something to think about.
Thanks, Jairo. Next up is Paul.
Yeah. I had a guy who worked for me who was one of the best people I've ever had work for me. And he said, he had a plaque on his wall that said, "Your failure to plan does not constitute my emergency." And that itself is an answer. But I also wanted to say that I talk to people about a model, and you use a lot of models, Srikant, of self, where we have 3 selves: emotional, physical, and mental. And if only one of them is driving the bus, life is chaos. But if you have an observer and a chooser that's above all that, the observer is calmly watching that and the chaos, and the chooser is guided in making choices, you're above all the chaos. So
yeah, that's wonderful. But see, I mean, my model is essentially, you have design in the middle, which is equivalent of planning or purpose or principles by which you're operating. And then that is driving action. And then you've got intuition and deliberation, which is giving you feedback. So those are the 4 elements. And just a plug, I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow at 12:30 Eastern in detail. Next up is Stefan.
Yeah, so I find that if I'm ever feeling like procrastinating or being passive, being lazy, I just try to remember that I'm going to pay a price no matter what. So if I'm going to be passive, I'm paying a price down the line, usually with my mind, just a lot of regret. And if I choose to be active, it's energy in the present. But I always find that energy expended in the present is a better trade-off than my mind in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Stefan. Next up is Julie.
I find that 3 things have worked for me. I think you're right about having a purpose, because when I keep that in mind, it's almost like as I move towards the light, the darkness falls of its own. The things that I do struggle with don't have the hold on me when I'm looking at that purpose or that light. And then another thing is that because not only are my habits habitual, so is everything during my day. A lot of the time, it's like I stop and do a timeout and say, is this getting me where I want to go? I get mindful about what I'm doing. And then the third thing is I focus. Beating myself up and punishing myself has never helped me get stronger and move towards whatever my goal is. So if I break it down and I focus on progress, or I focus on some strengths, then I can take a step out into something more difficult. And I think that this works with what you're saying too.
Thank you, Julie. So John, any closing comments about structure and chaos before we go to the next topic of non-negotiable things?
I think, and overall, something to encompass a lot of these responses is like awareness to our moment, awareness to what our particular decisions are based on our environmental cues, awareness to our structures and routines that we set up for ourselves. It seems to be like an underlying theme for a lot of people. And this structure can manifest itself in several environments and several experiences. For some people, maybe more analytical minded, or maybe more structured or disciplined, you could say. It could be manifested as a routine. In some people that are more maybe quote unquote spontaneous or go with the flow type people, it can manifest in terms of like checking in with themselves in the particular moment, right? It's not necessarily like habitual, it's not necessarily repetitive, but it is placing a significant emphasis on what am I doing right now and how am I exerting this control upon like this chaotic environment.
Excellent. So let's talk about the concept of non-negotiable. So what are non-negotiable things? How do you distinguish them from other things?
Right. So this is actually a really good question. We were exploring it very fruitfully in our breakout group. And I think to consolidate a lot of this with Deborah actually brought this up, Deborah with an H. She said a non-negotiable might mean something that would allow you to dispense with your self-respect. It's a very powerfully concise statement. And I think it's true. And I gave an example in the breakout group of like a non-negotiable is something that is going to allow me to lose, maybe even lose trust for myself or with myself. There's going to be some misalignment in my beliefs and my actions. So a practical example that I use is, let's say I want to approach somebody, whether this be like a networking event, whether it be an attractive person, I want to ask them on a date, whatever happens to be. I have this inclination, I have an intellectual impulse to do something that I'm going to benefit from. It could benefit them as well. I want to do something. I want to act my belief into the world, okay? That's my philosophy. That's the intellectual realm. But my body doesn't, okay? My body, it'll make up excuses. Oh, they look busy. I don't want to do that. I'm tired. I don't know enough. Like whatever you want to justify your failure with. Camus says, those who lack the courage will always find a philosophy to justify it. That's always been a powerful quote in the back of my mind in moments like that. So there's a disconnect, right? You have this line and you're not philosophically consistent. So it's like there's a break somewhere. There's a hole in some of your philosophy. It's not organized properly. You're not really in tune with yourself. And once you have that hole, like I said, there's a lack of trust. You have to reconcile with yourself later on. And what is particularly powerful is what really just stuck with me is something Stefan just said. Energy expended in the moment is always better. It's always a better choice, even if it's draining, even if it's challenging, right? It's energy expended in the moment is always better than having your mental faculties dwell on regret, on guilt, on shame, on lack of self-respect, on lack of self-trust. I know whenever I do something wrong, or in more cases, don't do something that I wanted to do, my conscience will yell at me for days and days and days, and it does not shut up. So that's like one of the most, I don't know, powerfully motivating things against, or for rather, putting these things into action. So in short, a non-negotiable can be something for you. Obviously, it's all subjective, like what it could be. So we use practical examples like you losing your job, losing your house, losing your relationship, etc. It's all going to be personal. But I think a good overall theme can be like something that's going to allow you to like mistrust yourself, or lose your confidence, or like question your identity, or something along that, or like lose your authenticity or your integrity. Like all of these are kind of coalesced together in this main point of a non-negotiable.
Excellent, excellent. So next up is Jean, followed by Michael. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to share a story. I think it really depends on this self-respect, the basic thing we need. But I heard a lot of ancient story, like this guy, he was fighting with somebody and he actually was crawling below somebody's leg, between the legs. Basically, that's the most humiliating thing people can do. And that guy was doing it because he has a bigger vision later. And everybody laughed at him, like, and in the end, he success. So I think sometimes if we have a bigger dream, we can sustain some type of humiliation, whatever. Most people can't because they don't have that bigger dream behind that, all those sacrifice. I just want to say, like, sometimes this standard may shift it because you have to sacrifice for a bigger dream later.
Thank you, Jean. Next up is Michael.
Yeah, this is a really interesting subject about your non-negotiables, because if you have a non-negotiable, that means you set a boundary. And if you are setting a boundary, that means that you're protecting something. So you really have to ask yourself, what are you protecting? Are you protecting some type of organization? Are you protecting some type of group? Or are you protecting some type of idea? Because if it's literally just an idea, then why do you feel like you need to protect it? It's a non-tangible thing. So you really have to get into the nitty-gritty of like how much that idea or that organization defines who you are as an individual. And that can be a very interesting conversation to people have as to why you feel like you need to set such a hard boundary. Safety is one area in which you obviously, you want to protect your physical being, but anything outside of your physical being, you really have to ask yourself, why is it important that you protect this?
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Next up is Mark.
Hi, thank you. I just want to follow up on something Michael was talking about. When I think of non-negotiables, I think about, it was driven from John's question, like, what if you lose a non-negotiable? Well, I would say maybe that shouldn't be a non-negotiable if it can be lost. Like talking about like, why do you have to put everything, all your eggs in something beyond your control? So I tend to think of my non-negotiables on me, myself, my personality, basically my values. Those are my non-negotiables. The person I want to be, or the person I like to think I am, those are my non-negotiables. Like being loyal to a country or an organization, yeah. But there's a degree of negotiation there. They can let me down. Maybe they're not worthy of my protection. So I would rarely make those things non-negotiables. Now, obviously, in personal relationships, emotions get in the way. So I'm not completely black and white on that, but that's where I try and focus. My concept of non-negotiables is it's something that's about me and under my control. It's not an external thing that's subject to the whims of fate.
Oh, excellent, excellent, Mark. Okay, John, any closing thoughts on this issue of non-negotiables?
No, not in particular. Not in particular. I do like the line of inquiry that Michael just established, though. If you have a non-negotiable, this means this is predicated on the idea you're setting a boundary, which is of course predicated on the fact of you're protecting something. So I'm going to do some journaling and look into that. It's a very, very interesting line of inquiry.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, folks. So this was wonderful. Thank you again, John. And we'll see you folks next time.
Mhm.
Bye.